old is Earth? People have probably wondered about where Earth came from and how old it is since the beginning of people. Aristotle is a well-known person from a long time ago who figured that Earth was pretty much around since the beginning of time. But it wasn't until the 1600s that someone came up with a very precise age for Earth. That person was James Ussher. He was an archbishop in Ulster, which is in Ireland. He used the Bible to come up with information that would help him determine the exact age of Earth. And what he came up with was a very precise date. October 23rd, 4004 BCE at precisely 9 a.m. was the moment of Earth's creation. In the 1700s, a guy named James Hutton was a gentleman farmer in Scotland, and he came up with a different idea. Hutton was observing his farm and noticed that the mountains seemed to erode into hills, and the hills eventually eroded into flatland. Hutton thought that would probably take longer than 6,000 years, and he came up with the idea that the Earth perhaps was very, very old. I'm sure Hutton wasn't the first person to come up with this idea. Hutton observed Hadrian's Wall, which is a structure built by the Romans in 122 current era in England, and he noticed that even though this structure was about 1,500 to 2,000 years old at the time, it didn't seem to be falling apart at all. And that was evidence for Hutton that perhaps the Earth was much older than the 6,000 years that was accepted at the time. Hutton's ideas were written down in a book called The Theory of Earth, which he published in 1788. He's well known today for his quote, "The present is the key to the past." By this, Hutton meant that the processes that shape Earth's surface today are probably the same processes that shaped Earth in the past. He's also known as the founder of modern geology. Well, it turned out that even though Hutton was absolutely brilliant, he was a terrible writer. It wasn't until Charles Lyell came along in the 1830s and wrote a 3-book series called The Principles of Geology that Hutton's ideas of an old Earth really got out. Lyell was a great writer. In fact, he inspired another Charles Darwin. Perhaps you've heard of him. Darwin took Charles Lyell's book with him when Darwin went around the globe on the HMS Beagle. And Darwin was inspired by the idea of a very old Earth. This led Darwin to think that maybe over enough time, living species could also change just like the surface of Earth changes. And today we know Darwin's theories as the theory of evolution. So, have you ever baked? Have you ever noticed when you put a loaf of bread or muffins or cookies out on the countertop to cool off that they start really hot and they become really cool? Well, Lord Kelvin, the same guy that the Kelvin scale that scientists use to measure is named for, he came up with a similar idea. He thought, well, the Earth is a little bit like a loaf of bread. When it comes out of the oven, it's hot, and over time it cools. He used mathematics to calculate exactly how long it would take for the Earth to cool from its molten beginnings to its present temperature. What did he come up with? Kelvin thought in 1899 that Earth's age was somewhere between 20 and 100 million years. As you can see from the graph, Kelvin's estimate was a little bit off, but getting closer. The problem with Kelvin's estimate was that he didn't know at the time that Earth has a center that contains radioactive materials, and these radioactive materials are constantly degrading, and when they do that, they give off heat, and that causes the Earth not only to lose heat, but also to gain heat from radioactive processes. Another way that scientists thought they could measure the age of the Earth was by looking at the amount of salt in the ocean. So this was the idea. Salt is found in rocks all over the surface of the Earth. If you could calculate how long it takes salt to be removed from rocks by water and rush down rivers out to the ocean, you could look at the present level of salinity in the ocean and calculate how long it took for the ocean to get there, and then use that to figure out the age of the Earth. John Joly was a famous scientist who used this method to calculate Earth's age. In 1910, he estimated that Earth's age was 80 to 150 million years old. One problem, though, with Joly's calculation was that he assumed that the ocean started out with 0% salinity, and we don't really know if that's true. The other thing that Joly didn't know about was plate tectonics. He didn't know that the crust, including the oceanic crust, was constantly being recycled. And as you can see, salt in the ocean goes into the crust beneath the ocean, and when that crust gets recycled through subduction, the salt goes with it. And that changes the amount of the salt in the ocean, and that would change the calculation for Earth's age. In the early 1900s, scientists figured out that radioactive materials decay. This means that radioactive materials lose protons and eventually turn into other elements that are stable. One of these elements that is well known is uranium. Uranium has 92 protons, but given enough time, it will lose some of those protons and turn into lead, which has 82 protons. If you know the rate at which uranium turns to lead, then you can look at rocks that contain uranium and compare the ratio of uranium to lead to figure out how old that rock actually is. And that's what Arthur Holmes did in 1912. He used this radiometric dating technique to estimate Earth's age at 1.6 billion years. What Holmes didn't know, though, again, was about plate tectonics. Today we know that plates are constantly moving and recycling themselves. They move rocks with them. So the oldest rocks on Earth were actually not as old as the Earth itself. Luckily, a clever American guy named Clair Patterson came up with the idea of using radiometric dating to calculate the age of meteorites. So he figured meteorites were created during the same events that created Earth itself. So if you could calculate the age of a meteorite, then you could calculate the age of Earth. And that's what he did. In 1953, he used meteorites to calculate Earth's age at 4.55 billion years. And that is the number that's accepted today. Sometimes you'll hear it as 4.6 billion years, but that's just because people are rounding it off. So if anybody asks you Earth's age, you can tell them that Earth today is considered to be 4.55 billion years old by most scientists. Pretty amazing, huh? Who knew? You learn something new every day.